In 1950, the United States Navy released bacteria into the air over a major American city, not as an attack, but as a test. No warnings were given, no one was told. And for days, people went to work, made dinner, tucked their kids into bed, completely unaware they were breathing something that wasn't supposed to be there. By the time anyone started asking questions, it was already over, and most people never knew it happened at all. This is The Quiet Work, a Meals to Unalive For series where in between the stories you see, life keeps moving. The routine, the chores, the small moments that feel normal. And underneath it all, the darker history, the quiet experiments, and the things that were never meant to be noticed, but happened anyway. If you heard something like this out of context, that the US military once released bacteria over an American city, it would sound like a conspiracy theory. The kind of story that gets passed around, exaggerated, and eventually dismissed because it feels too extreme to be real. And to be fair, most people don't spend their time digging through declassified military documents or Cold War era experiments. So when something like this does come up, it usually gets filtered through headlines, secondhand retellings, or quick summaries that leave out most of the details. But this isn't one of those stories where the facts are unclear. It isn't based on speculation or a single source. The test itself was documented, studied, and later acknowledged as part of a broader effort to understand biological warfare. And that's really where this starts to make more sense, not in the context of today, but in the mindset of the early 1950s. At the time, the United States was entering a new kind of conflict. The Cold War wasn't being fought on traditional battlefields. It was being fought through intelligence, strategy, and preparation for scenarios that hadn't fully happened yet. There was a growing concern that future wars wouldn't just rely on bombs or weapons you could see coming. There was a real possibility that an enemy could use something far less obvious, something airborne, something that could spread without warning. And if that were the case, cities wouldn't just be targets. They would be environments, places where something could move quietly, carried by the wind, by movement, by everyday life. So the military started asking a very specific question. If something like that were released over a major US city, how far would it spread? Not in theory, not in a controlled lab setting, but in real world conditions, with real weather pattern, real buildings, and real population density. Because a test on paper doesn't tell you much, and a simulation only goes so far. If you want a real answer, you have to test it somewhere that behaves like an actual city. And eventually, that's exactly what they decided to do. They chose a location that would give them the most accurate results possible, a city with dense population, consistent coastal winds, and geography that would allow airborne particles to move inland in a predictable way. That city was San Francisco, California. Once the military decided they needed real world data, the next step was figuring out how to actually run the test. Not just where, but how to do it in a way that would give them usable results. The goal wasn't to make people sick, at least not intentionally. The goal was to simulate what would happen if a biological agent were released over a populated area, and then track how it moved. That meant they needed something that could behave like a harmful agent, something that could spread through the air, travel with the wind, and be detected after the fact. But that was believed at the time to be relatively harmless. The bacteria they chose was called Serratia marcescens. It had a few properties that made it useful for this kind of test. It could survive in the air long enough to travel, it was easy to grow in large quantities, and it produced a distinctive red pigment, which made it easier to identify when it showed up later in samples. In other words, it was something they could release and then track. But releasing it wasn't as simple as putting it in the air. They needed to understand how it would behave once it left its point of origin, how far it would travel, how concentrated it would remain, and how widely it would disperse across an actual city. That meant controlling for variables they couldn't replicate indoors: wind direction, humidity, temperature, and the physical layout of streets and buildings. And that's where the location became critical. San Francisco wasn't chosen at random. It offered a combination of factors that made it ideal for this kind of test. The city sits along the coast, which meant consistent ocean winds would carry airborne particles inland. Its geography, hills, dense neighborhoods, and tightly packed buildings, created a natural environment to observe how something might spread through an urban area. And just as important, It had a large enough population to produce meaningful data. If something moved through the city, there would be ways to detect it. The plan was to release the bacteria offshore, let the wind carry it naturally, and then measure how far it traveled by collecting samples from different parts of the city. To do that, the military worked with researchers who would monitor the results. They placed collection points in various locations, areas where the bacteria might settle after being carried inland. Then they would wait, gather the samples, and see how much of it showed up and where. If the bacteria appeared across large portions of the city, it would confirm something important, that a biological agent released from a single point could spread much further than people might expect. And if that were true, it would change how vulnerable a city like San Francisco really was. Once the plan was in place, there was only one thing left to do. They had to carry it out and see what actually happened. In September of 1950, the test moved out of planning and into execution. Just off the coast of San Francisco, a U.S. Navy ship took position in the Pacific. From there, the setup was relatively simple. The bacteria had been prepared in advance, grown in large quantities, and loaded onto the ship with equipment designed to disperse it into the air. The idea wasn't to release it all at once. It needed to be spread in a way that would mimic how an actual airborne agent might be deployed, gradually, and in a form that could be carried naturally by the wind. So instead of a single release, the ship dispersed the bacteria in repeated passes over the course of several days. Each time, a fine mist was pushed out into the air just off the shoreline. Once it left the ship, there was nothing directing it anymore. No guidance, no control, just air currents. And those currents carried it exactly where the military expected it to go, inland, across the waterfront, into the streets, and through the neighborhoods of the city. At that point, the test wasn't happening on the ship anymore. It was happening in the city itself. The bacteria moved through the air the same way anything airborne would, spreading outward, settling onto surfaces, and continuing to travel as long as conditions allowed for it. And because it couldn't be seen, no one reacted to it. There was no visible sign that anything had been released, no unusual smell, no immediate symptoms, nothing that would have made someone stop and think something was wrong. To the people living there, it was just another stretch of normal days. People opened their windows, walked outside, went about their routines without any reason to think they should do otherwise. And all the while, the test was unfolding exactly the way it had been designed to. Over time, the bacteria spread across large portions of the city. Samples collected later would show just how far it had traveled and how effectively it had dispersed. From a testing standpoint, it was successful. It proved that a city like San Francisco, with its geography, its population, and its natural airflow, could be exposed from a single point offshore without anyone realizing it was even happening. And once the test was complete, the ship left, but the bacteria didn't. The bacteria used in the test was called Serratia marcescens. It wasn't chosen randomly. At the time, it was considered a practical option for simulating how a biological agent might behave in the air. Serratia marcescens is a species of bacteria that occurs naturally in the environment. It can be found in soil, in water, and on plant material. Under certain conditions, it produces a distinctive red pigment, which made it easier for researchers to identify in samples. That visibility mattered, because once the bacteria was released, the only way to measure its spread was by detecting where it would end up. Researchers could collect samples from different parts of the city, surfaces, air filters, collection plates, and then analyze them to see how far the bacteria had traveled and how concentrated it was. From a testing standpoint, it offered two advantages. It behaved like an airborne organism, and it could be tracked after the fact. The assumption at the time was that Serratia marcescens was relatively harmless to humans. It wasn't considered a primary pathogen, and it had been used in other experiments as a stand in for more dangerous organisms. That assumption played a major role in the decision to use it in a real world environment, because if the bacteria had been known to cause serious illness, this type of test likely wouldn't have been carried out in the same way. But relatively harmless doesn't mean completely harmless. And even at the time, there were limits to how well its effects were understood, especially outside of controlled settings. Serratia marcescens is now recognized as what's known as an opportunistic pathogen. That means it doesn't typically cause illness in healthy individuals, but it can lead to infections under the right conditions. In particular, it has been associated with respiratory infections, urinary tract infections, and bloodstream infections, especially in hospital environments or among people with weakened immune systems. In 1950, however, that understanding wasn't as fully developed. The focus was on how the bacteria moved, not necessarily on how it might affect every individual it came into contact with. From the military's perspective, the goal was to simulate exposure, not to create harm. But once the bacteria was released into an uncontrolled environment, there was no way to limit who might come in contact with it. It wasn't being tested in isolation, it was being tested in a city, and in a city, exposure isn't uniform. Some people would come into contact with very small amounts. Others might be exposed more directly, depending on where they lived, how the wind carried it, and how long it remained in the air. That variability wasn't something that could be fully predicted in advance. It was part of what the test was meant to measure. And once the bacteria had spread through the city, the only thing left to do was observe what happened next. In the days following the test, there was no immediate public response, no announcements were made, and no connection was drawn between what had been released and what was happening in the city. But within a short period of time, physicians in San Francisco began to notice something unusual. A number of patients at Stanford were presenting with infections caused by Serratia marcescens, a bacterium that was not commonly seen in that setting at the time. Over the course of several days, multiple cases appeared that involved the same organism. Among those cases was a patient named Edward Nevin. He was recovering from a surgical procedure when he developed a severe infection. The infection progressed into his bloodstream, a condition known as septicemia. Despite treatment, his condition worsened, and he later passed away. At the time, his death was attributed to complications related to the infection. There was no indication that it was connected to anything outside of the hospital environment. Years later, when details of the test became public, his family raised questions about whether the exposure may have played a role. That connection was never definitively proven, but the timing and the presence of the same bacterium led to the ongoing debate about whether the test contributed to his death. Outside of those cases, there were no reports of widespread illnesses across the city. The majority of people exposed did not experience noticeable effects. From a data standpoint, the test was considered successful. Samples collected throughout San Francisco showed that the bacteria had spread over a large area. In some locations, it was detected miles from the point of release. The distribution patterns confirmed that airborne particles could move through the city efficiently under the right conditions. That result provided the military with the information it was looking for. It demonstrated that a single release point offshore could lead to broad exposure across an urban environment. What it didn't fully account for was how far that exposure might affect individuals in less predictable ways. Because once the bacteria entered the city, it was no longer part of that controlled experiment. It became part of the environment, and the people within that environment had no awareness that they had been exposed. For years, the test remained unknown to the public. The data had been collected, the results had been analyzed, and the operation itself was considered complete. But the story didn't end there. For more than 2 decades, the details of the test were not widely known to the public. There was no announcement in 1950 and no immediate follow up explaining what had been done. It wasn't until the 1970s that information about tests like this began to surface more clearly. During that time, increased scrutiny of military and intelligence activities led to the release of previously classified material. Among those records were documents describing a series of biological field tests conducted by the U.S. military. Operation Sea Spray was one of them. The documents outlined the purpose of the test, the method of dispersal, and the results that were observed afterward. They confirmed that bacteria had been released off the coast of San Francisco and that its spread had been tracked throughout the city. The findings showed that the organism had traveled significant distances inland. In some cases, it was detected miles from the original release point, demonstrating how effectively airborne particles could move through an urban environment. At the time those results were recorded, they were considered useful data. They provided a clearer understanding of how a biological agent could behave under real conditions. But when those details became public years later, the focus shifted. The question was no longer just what the test had shown, but how it had been conducted. Specifically, whether it was appropriate to carry out that kind of experiment in a populated city without informing the people who lived there. In response, legal action was taken by the family of Edward Nevin. They argued that the bacteria released during the test may have contributed to the infection that led to his death. The case went through the federal court system, where the central issue was whether a direct connection could be established between the test and his illness. Ultimately, the court ruled against the claim. The decision was based on the available evidence at the time, which did not conclusively link the exposure to his death. Even so, the case drew attention to a broader use of open air testing during that period. It was not the only instance where substances had been released into populated areas for research purposes. Other tests conducted in different locations also became part of the public record, contributing to a larger discussion on how those programs had been managed. Other cities that were tested in similar fashion were St. Louis, Missouri, which was heavily targeted in the 1950s and 60s with zinc cadmium sulfide sprayed from planes and rooftops, specifically in low income, predominantly black neighborhoods. Minneapolis, Minnesota, targeted in 1953 with mock anthrax attacks. Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada, part of the 1953 tests with simulated anthrax agents as well. Washington, D.C., bacteria was sprayed in the Pentagon's air conditioning system in 1949 and the National Airport and Greyhound bus terminal in 1965. New York City, New York. Light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis were dropped into the subway system in 1966. Corpus Christi, Texas, site of a zinc cadmium sulfide spraying in the 1950s. The Pennsylvania Turnpike. Areas along the highway were also targeted. And then again, San Francisco had continued testing after 1950, along with offshore ship based sprays in Operation Shad and Project 112. By the time it came to light, Operation Sea Spray itself was no longer active. The test had taken place decades earlier, and the data it produced had already been incorporated into military research. What remained was the documentation, a record of what had been done, how it had been carried out, and what had been learned from it. And that record changed how the test was understood, not as a theory or a rumor, but as a confirmed event. When Operation Sea Spray was carried out, the people living in San Francisco didn't know it was happening. Not because it was hidden particularly well, but because no one had any reason to think something like that would be done in the first place. It wasn't presented as a warning, it wasn't debated publicly, it was simply carried out and documented afterward. And for more than 20 years, it stayed out of the public view. Today, it's easy to look back at something like this and see it as part of a different time. The Cold War, different priorities, different standards. But the part that tends to stick with people isn't what was done, it's how it was done. Quietly, without public awareness, and without the people affected having any way to question it while it was happening. And that raises a broader question. Not about 1950, but about now. If something like this were carried out today, something small, controlled, and not immediately noticeable, would anyone know? Or would it look exactly the same? Just another normal day, with no visible reason to question anything. And if tests like this were once considered acceptable, it's worth asking what's changed and what hasn't.